Welcome to Sew Very Easy. My name is Laura, and I found some fabric that is really as cute as a button, and I do hope you like it too. And I really mean buttons, needle and thread, pins, this wonderful fabric that is printed on the diagonal, and a really big, cute border print fabric. This fabric is from Maywood Studios. It's called Measure Twice. And I'm going to use this fabric and make a small quilt. This quilt is 39.5 inches square. It's also a free pattern from Maywood Studios, so we'll put a link in the description. But I'm not using this fabric. I'm going to use this Measure Twice fabric. So the first thing I need to do is change my fabrics. My fabric 1, I will be using this beautiful soft rose color. Fabric number 2, this yellow. Fabric 3 will be these beautiful buttons. Fabric 4, a soft white. Fabric 5, my sewing pins. This striped fabric I'm going to use for binding. I'm going to add an additional border with this big print. So this inside pattern is about 39.5 inches, but it definitely will be bigger with this big border print. So let's cut all of the fabrics and leave this border print to cut till last. I'm going to start by making that heart. To make the one heart, we're going to need 2 rectangles, 6.5 by 12.5 inches. We will need 4 3-inch blocks, and they will go on the top of each of those rectangles. On those 3-inch squares, we need to draw a line from corner to corner, and then we're going to stitch on that corner. So we're going to be making that top of the heart. So we must be sure to have those going in the right direction so we can do that top shape. We're going to stitch on those lines. We also will need some squares for the bottom. And they're going to be big 6.5-inch squares. They'll fit right onto that bottom. We need that line from corner to corner on that 6.5-inch square. So we're having those seams come up. So let's sew those 6 seams. When those seams have been stitched, for the one block, press all the seams coming up. For the second block, we want to press that back piece back. And that way we will have opposite seams here and opposite seams here. Once those seams have been pressed, we can cut off that extra and leave a 1/4 inch seam allowance. We will now be able to match up the center square, nestle those seams, and stitch a 1/4 inch. Press that seam, open. We now have that big center heart done. The next thing we're going to make are these 4 hourglass blocks. We start with squares, we cut those squares in half twice and sew them back together. Or we can do them a different way. So let's start with something just a little bit bigger, and then we can square them down. This block will equal 12.5 inches. So start with a 13.5 inch square. We will need 2 of the main button fabric, 1 of that light yellow and 1 of that beige background. Match the button onto each of the different fabrics. Draw a line right down the center and stitch a 1/4 inch on each side. We're going to do that to both these blocks. We can now cut along that center line on both of these pieces, so we will now have a total of 4. Open these half square triangles up and press the seams to the dark side. We have 2 of the squares with one color, 2 of the squares with the second color. We're going to match up 2 of the opposites together. So I will have the buttons on opposite side, and I have the yellow on one and the white on the other. So I'll have 2 that look like this. Nestle those center seams together and draw a line from corner to corner, crossing over that center seam, and then stitch a 1/4 inch on each side of that seam. We just need to feel in here, make sure that those seams are matched up, and do that to both squares. Once those 2 rows have been done, cut apart right on that line we drew. Now when we open them up, we will have 4 identical squares, and these are called hourglass blocks. For that back seam, we can just take that seam and pull it apart, and then press those seams going in opposite direction. So that's going to open up, and it's going to be a little 4 patch there. These 4 hourglass blocks need to equal 12.5 inches. If you start with 13.5 inches, you're going to have just a tiny little bit to trim down. If you really like to trim down, you can always start those squares at 14 inches. Use whatever measurement you feel comfortable using. And put these aside. We will need to make these little 9 patches with this little side piece. To speed up the sewing of those 9 patches, we're going to make some strip sets. Cut 2 strips at 3 inches with the pin fabric and the light fabric. And sew just these 2 strips together. Match up those edges and sew 1/4 inch so you have one long piece. With those 2 strips sewn together, press the fabric to this darker piece. We will be making 4 of these 9 patches. So we're going to need 4 of these center strips. So we're going to work with this first strip that we sewed together, and we're going to need to start with a piece a little bit more than 12 inches. Keep in mind we're going to trim off this selvage, so go from one end and measure up about 12.5 inches and cut that piece off. Now add on a 12.5 inch piece from this white strip. So those are going to go together. I'll be able to take these and trim them into 4 3-inch strips, and that will give us that center bar. We will need 8 of these outside pieces. So we will be able to take that darker piece and sew that strip together so the white is in the center. We will end up with a longer piece from that dark piece, and we can take care of that after. So match up those seams and sew those together. So from that little piece with that darker in the center, I was able to trim out 4 3-inch pieces. These are the centers. From that second long piece, I was able to get 8 of those 3-inch strips, and I did have a little bit left over. Divide that pile in half so we have 4 on each, and that will fit right in the center. Sew these blocks together using a 1/4 inch. If you don't like the strip piece, you can cut 23-inch blocks and 16 white-inch blocks and put them together. We need to finish these corners off with some pieces on the side. We will need 4 pieces, 5 inches by 8 inches, and those 4 are going to be joined on. For the side, we're going to need 4 pieces, 5 inches by 12.5 inches. So that's going to give us 4 corners. We now have the 1 center block, the 4 hourglass blocks, and 4 corner blocks. We get to put these together. The hourglass blocks are going to go towards the center heart, and because those fabrics match, it now has the appearance that the heart is inside a big square. The corners get to go on. All of these blocks are 12.5 inches, so we will be able to sew them together in 3 rows. We can always add a little border like they have on the original pattern, but I want to add this nice big border after. So let's get this sewn together, and then we can get this cut and put on. The quilt is 36.5 inches, and we're going to need that measurement as we cut out this large border print. The border fabric runs along the length of the fabric, and we can keep that in mind when we buy our fabric. That way we don't have to cut and piece it. These border print fabrics usually have 4 designs running down that length of fabric, and there is a repeat. And the easiest way is to find one side, see where that pattern starts, and find that duplicate. And you will find that you will have approximately 10 inches for each of these borders. So you'll need to choose where you're going to cut the border. Do you want a 10-inch border Or do you want to have a smaller border? We're going to have to keep that in mind when we put the borders around that quilt. We will be mitering the corners, so it's going to look like that border is going all the way around. I will be using that 10-inch mark, and I'm going to find one area where I'm going to cut for all of the repeats. Because the quilt is 36.5 inches, I will be using a 10-inch border. I'm going to need 36 inches plus 10 inches and 10 inches. So I will need at least 56, 57 inches of fabric. And that will just save us from having to piece it. The next thing would be to press this fabric. We're going to press it well now, and then we will not be pressing it until all of the stitching is done. I'm going to be cutting in between this pattern. So it looks like a row of stitching here. I'm going to go 1/4 inch up. So I'm going to do that on all 4 of the pieces. So I'm going to use this edge, line it up along the ruler, and trim. So I will have 4 pieces cut, with this piece being the 1/4 inch. So I now have those 4 long strips cut out. From here I need to decide what is going to go in towards the quilt and what is going to be the outside. For this quilt, I'm going to decide that that pattern is going to face in. Place those 4 layers together and match up that edge that you're going to be stitching on. And it does not need to be exact. Smooth out the fabric. It's already pressed. I'm going to be marking the bottom of all 4 of these borders. And I'm going to do them the same time, and that's going to save me some time. The first mark you're going to need is going to be the width of this plus a little bit. So I have a 10-inch border. I'm going to go over about 11 inches. And I'm going to put a mark. And from that mark, I need to find a 36.5 inch mark. So I have at least 11 inches on one side, 36.5 inches from mark to mark, and I need to make sure that I have 11 inches on this side. I'm going to start to add this onto the quilt. On each corner of the quilt, we need to find a 1/4 inch mark. And this little 1/4 inch mark is going to be a stopping and starting point. So we need to put this mark on the 4 corners. And that will be on the back side of the quilt. The 4 borders are all together, and my quilt top fits in between those markings. So I have that extra on the outside. The markings equal that outside measurement. Take that top border, line it up. So the marks that we put on that border are going to match that outside fabric. And we're going to pin that border on and pin with the heads of the pin sticking outside. The pin heads are sticking outside of the fabric because we're going to be sewing so that we can see that quilt. So here's the mark on that border, which was 36.5 inches, and it's going to line up to the edge of that quilt. But we're going to start stitching right here in this 1/4 inch mark. Stitch all the way down, and then we're going to stop on that X on the other side. So we will have this little flap on both sides. That first border is on, and I've stopped and started right there at that point. That first border is put on. Now do not press. We just need to move this extra fabric out of the way. So I fold so I can see that 1/4 inch seam. Just pin that border out of the way. Rotate your quilt. Now I'm going to be able to flip this border on top. Once again, those marks from this border are going to match both edges of the quilt. I will be sewing all 4 of these borders on first before I do any pressing and any miters. Match that up on both sides and pin once again with those pin heads sticking out. We're going to be able to bring this quilt top to the machine, and we're going to stop and start right there at that 1/4 inch mark. That second border is on, and we need to pin it out of the way. Continue to stitch all 4 of these borders on in this way. Once all those borders have been stitched on, I can remove the pins and release all of the borders. So my 4 corners look like this. I've stopped and started at that 1/4 inch, and I have these flaps. I'm going to miter these corners one at a time. I still have not pressed. I want to match this edge and this edge together. So I'm going to be folding the quilt. So I'm going to have a fold coming down the center. So it's on this angle, which means these edges are going to match up. I have those 2 floppy pieces matched up. Let me do it so it's facing you. So facing you, you're going to have those 2 outside edges together. And this is that quilt. It's been folded on an angle. And this area is really not important right now. What we're wanting to do is make sure that this fabric is flat so the top lays the same as that bottom. Match up the top of this strip and match up the bottom of the strip. The miter is going to come from this corner where we stopped and started and go out. Take this top fabric and make sure the seams are coming up. And you can pin them so that they stay up and that the edges are together. And that dot is where we stopped and started our stitching. If I put a pin right through the center, I should end up with the threads on one side and the threads on the second side. I'm going to use that dot right there. I will use a 45-degree mark on the ruler, and that 45-degree line is going to line up along the bottom of this row. Now we're going to be able to take that and just slide it right over until the edge of the ruler hits that dot. Put something that you can mark with right there where you've stopped and started. Now you can draw that line. Now we're going to be able to pin this. You can peek underneath and make sure that your borders are lined up. I'm going to start by putting my needle straight down right where the stitching stopped and started, and stitch down. When we do open it up, we're going to have 1 piece on one side, 1 piece on another. This is going to keep this seam flat. The other thing we're going to do is take this seam and press it down. So all of these seam allowances are going to come up. This gets tucked inside, and that corner lines up perfect. Once all 4 of these corners are done, we can take it to the iron and press it from that back side, putting those seam allowances towards this corner. See, it really is as cute as a button. 1 big block for the center, 1 big border, and this quilt now equals about 55 inches. You can always change that direction of the border, and of course, changing fabric is always fun to do. I'll put a link in the description to the free pattern from Maywood Studios, and that way you can give this a try yourself. Regardless if you make it with or without the border, it really is as cute as a button. Thank you for joining me today on Sew Very Easy. Feel free to subscribe, and as always, come on back. Let's see what we're talking about in sewing next time in the sewing room. Bye for now.